Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Comic Source Comic Boom collaboration. Time for another Spawn Daily. We're up to issue number 42 as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of Spawn by reading all of Spawn, at least all of the original series that started way back in 1992 by Todd McFarlane. So, as I said, we're up to issue 42 on the Daily Spawn. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll dive into the book. So really cool Tony Daniel cover. It does seem as though Tony Daniel and Greg Capullo are sort of switching off issues right now, probably due to the just amount of detail that they put in their art. So as we turn the page, we can see the credits. Story by Todd McFarlane. Tony Daniel does the pencils. Kevin Conrad on inks. Tom Orzechowski on letters, with Steve Oliff, Quinn Suppley, and Oli Optics on the colors. We do get a little bit of a summary for Spawn number 41. We saw last issue that Curse was dissecting Spawn. Spawn was able to break free thanks to his symbiotic costume. And in response to that jailbreak, I guess you'd say, by Spawn, Curse said, you know, if you believe in something, you should be willing to die for it. And he blew up his castle, his fortress, his stronghold, whatever you want to call it. And it appeared as though Spawn was caught in the blast. We also saw that Saigor was continuing his journey towards New York for an unknown reason. And we did check in finally on Jason Wynn and the Violator in his clown form. So this one starts off and we're told that there's a thing. The thing is traveling at extraordinary speed, red hot before it's gone a mile. It's spinning, it's twisting, it's contorting, and its pulpy interior is protected by an outer shell. So basically, this is Spawn. As we see as it crash lands and then skids along the ground, we see from the smoking crater arises Spawn. So basically, we saw last issue his symbiotic costume almost in a liquid type form, swallowing up all the different pieces of Al Simmons' body that had been dissected, trying to kind of put it together like a scarecrow. And so, you know, perhaps because Spawn's body wasn't assembled, I guess I'll say, for lack of a better way to put it. Whoops, didn't mean to stop sharing there. Sorry about that. Yeah, for lack of a better way to put it, Spawn's body wasn't assembled. Perhaps that allowed that elasticity of the costume to sort of protect it. And we do see that once he lands and has a chance to recover, he does get up, but he still doesn't look, healed. You know, it even says, like a scarecrow without physical structure to bear its own weight, Spawn rises, but it's really only because the costume compels him to do so. Basically, the costume is sort of acting as an exoskeleton right now, and how that's going to work, how it's going to be able to draw energy from Al Simmons if his body is not in good shape, I guess that remains to be seen. Meanwhile, we saw last issue that Twitch and Sam Burke and Twitch had been fired from their job as New York police detectives. So that doesn't mean they're willing to give up the case they have against Chief Banks. So they're going over all the evidence they have, trying to figure out exactly what they need to find in order to exonerate themselves and make Chief Banks pay for what he's done. And they're sort of lamenting the fact that they don't have concrete evidence. They don't have that smoking gun that will link Banks to the things in the files, right? It's all sort of circumstantial evidence at this point. We do also get an appearance by Twitch's wife that Sam Burke is just beside himself about how good looking, I guess, and how sexy Twitch's wife is, which is pretty funny in a lot of ways. So meanwhile, in West Virginia, where Spawn crash landed after the explosion, we see there's a little kid, a young boy who's running through some woods trying to reach a hideout. He talks about the fact that he has to do this every Wednesday. He goes and buys comics. It's pretty obvious. And these bullies chase him and try to steal his comics, any money he has left. So he hides out. He tries not to damage his books. Even back then in the 90s, he's aware that, you know, these are collectibles. He wants to be sure he takes care of them. So when he gets to his hideout, he's sort of attacked because Spawn chose that shack, this little hideout this boy uses, as his hideout. And the costume doesn't know whether this kid's friend or foe, so it kind of hoists him up, and the kid's like, don't hurt me, I'll do anything you want. And it's sort of fortuitous that this boy is the one that finds Spawn. He's got a lot of knowledge. I love the way that McFarlane writes a story in terms of, hey, here's a comic reader, and that must mean that he's intelligent, right? And so he's talking to Spawn, and Spawn's saying, yeah, I'm not really in control. It's the costume right now because my body's damaged or whatever. And it is interesting. There's so many references in this book to like actual real entities and characters and whatnot. And I'm a little surprised that McFarlane was able to get away with it, honestly. But anyway, the little boy's like, oh, your costume's alive, just like Venom. So again, referencing a Marvel character, I'm a little surprised. And he's like, oh, you must be a superhero. And Spawn kind of begs off. I'm not, necessarily a superhero, but we see in the background there, I mean, that's clearly Hulk, Savage Dragon, looks to be some of the characters, like, who's that, maybe Speedball, and Wild Child, maybe. So anyway, he's mentioning this boy's like, oh, Youngblood, Avengers, Fantastic Four, X-Men. Clearly he's got, and we even see an X-Force comic, and there's kind of a joke about Tony Daniels. Tony Daniels was drawing X-Force before he came on to Spawn. And this little boy even mentions it. Oh, X-Force used to be my favorite until Tony Daniels left, but that's still okay, I guess. So yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyway, through the course of this conversation, Spawn sort of learns about himself just because this boy is so knowledgeable about comics. And, based on the fact that Spawn doesn't even really understand how his powers work and that kind of thing. So the little boy's asking him, what are your powers? What are your moves? And Spawn's like, I don't really know. He's like, well, do you have a symbol? And this little boy, he very much lives in a fantasy world because that's where he can be the hero and not be bullied like he is every day at school. And he has a costume on under his shirt. He calls himself the Terrorizer, and he's got this stylized T. And he asks Spawn, he says, what's your stand for? It looks like an M. And Spawn mentions that Malbolgia was the one that gave him his powers. He goes, oh, maybe that's what it stands for. And Spawn's like, no, it doesn't stand for anything. It's just a symbol. And he says, okay, well, did this Malbolgia guy give powers to anyone else that you know of? Spawn's thinking about the Violator. He's like, yeah. He goes, well, does he have the same mark? And you see right there on the page that the clown does. He does have a similar mark. And Spawn's like, oh my God, it is an M. So it's kind of funny. I don't know if it actually is or isn't, or some kind of in-joke, but it's just funny because this little boy figured it out, and he's sort of, in a way, educating Spawn on who he is. So, but he does live somewhat of a sad life in terms of, he's not happy being bullied all the time and having his comics stolen, and he wants to be a hero, and he wants to be noticed, and he wants to be special. He wants to have friends, and he wants to be strong and have powers, and Spawn, to Al Simmons' credit, does a pretty good job here of explaining that being a hero is more than having muscles. He says it's about standing up for what's right, even when others disagree. And the kid's like, well, you sound like my dad. Spawn's like, no, I'm not trying to lecture you. But, there's a lot of bad stuff in this world, and it comes up all the time in different places where you least expect. And you just need to find a way to stand up in your own way. And the kid's like, okay, I can try that. Then he asks about the next thing that he's most interested in other than comics, which is girls. He asks Spawn if he has a girlfriend. It's interesting. Spawn says he does while thinking of Wanda. Like, yeah, she's not really your girlfriend, dude. She's married to somebody else, but I get it, right? He's given up everything to come back for Wanda. So, he probably thinks about her that way. Meanwhile, we do check in on Wanda as well as Grandma Blake. This is just sort of a reminder issue, or a reminder scene in the issue, I should say, because like I said, we had 3 or 4 issues where we went without seeing Wanda and Terry Fitzgerald. We know that the Violator had charged Jason Wynn with tightening the noose, pushing the buttons, making these people that Spawn cares about deeply think that they're in good shape in their lives and then pull the rug out from under them. So we're reminded again that there was this huge anonymous cash donation to the charity that Wanda Blake runs that was used to start building an addition to the Children's Hospital. And we're also reminded that that Grandma Blake was having some tax issues with the IRS. And those all got ironed out, and her pension check even increased in amount a little bit. So everything seems to be going well for them. But as Wanda's putting away the groceries that she bought for Grandma Blake, she starts coughing enough to where Grandma Blake's worried, and Wanda says, "Oh, I'm probably just coming down with something. It's probably all the stress of what Terry's been going through at work, and what I've been dealing with this whole Spawn thing and whatnot." We do get a quick interlude with Saigor. We're told that he's, for some reason, drawn to New York. He doesn't know why. He just knows he has to get to the right place in New York because there's a secret there. And his brain, or what's left of it, tells him that he's got to feed, and then he's got to be strong when he gets to wherever he needs to get, which is described as a jungle that's massive and gray, with shadows to hide many secrets. And we see him speak for the first time. He says, New York. So what exactly that means, who the gorilla is, the cybernetic gorilla, we still don't know. But I suppose we'll find out through the course of the series. So meanwhile, Sam and Twitch have decided to sneak back into the precinct to try to find that concrete evidence that they need to tie Chief Banks to the circumstantial evidence that's in the file that Spawn gave them. But they can't get in his office. It's locked. They don't even know where to look. And they run into another detective there. Not exactly sure who this guy is, if he's setting them up. Seems a little coincidental, seems a little convenient, but this guy's talking about how he's about to get fired, and he's apparently an enemy of Chief Banks, and they're out to get him. And so he decides to turn over some keys that he had made at one point in his career that unlock this filing cabinet in the chief's office. And when Sam and Twitch ask, like, well, why are you helping us? And he says, well, the people that Chief Banks hangs out with are pretty heavy hitters, and they don't mess around. And if you guys are here causing them problems, it can buy me time to disappear. So it makes sense what he says, but again, the reason I'm suspicious about it is because it's a little ex deus machina. It's a little like, oh, they're completely trapped. McFarlane's painted them into a corner, and then all of a sudden, oh, look, there's a door right behind them, and this guy's their way out. So it's a little convenient. And if you think that's convenient, the fact that inside that filing cabinet, bingo, Sam Burke says, they've got receipts from the courier service, moving items from one place to another, all these financial documents tying Chief Banks to the politicians and the web of conspiracy that was in place to have Senator Jennings' daughter killed by Billy Kincaid. So bad enough you do this thing, right? If you're Chief Banks, you leave a paper trail? Like, that just doesn't seem really smart, especially if you're a chief of police and you understand investigative techniques. But okay, let's say you're worried that at some point you're going to be the fall guy, so you keep a paper trail, you keep evidence, so if anybody ever turns on you, you can turn around and implicate them and burn the whole thing down. Maybe I'll buy that. But you keep the papers in a police station? Like, that's just a bridge too far. Like, bad enough that you keep evidence that incriminates yourself, but then you keep the evidence in a police station? That's just, no. That's just dumb, right? I don't think anybody would do that. And Chief Banks hasn't ever come across as dumb, as like a blockhead, because it would take somebody of very low intelligence to do that, to keep evidence that would implicate you in the conspiracy to murder a child, that you would keep that evidence in your own office in a police station. It defies logic. It doesn't make sense at all. So it's a little nitpick. Rather they would have, found out he had a storage locker or something else that just made more sense. That just didn't sit well with me. Meanwhile, back to the kid who likes to collect comics. He's got to get home. It's late. He's got to leave his little clubhouse and head home. But unbeknownst to him, the bullies that were waiting for him or were trying to catch him have been waiting. They've been waiting all along. I don't know if they maybe know where his hideout is, but they've been waiting. And so you know what? As I'm reading this right now, I'm trying to see, does this little boy ever say what his name is? I'm flipping through, trying to see, because we know one of the bullies is Tommy, but I don't know if they ever say what his name is, which I find to be really interesting. Even when, yeah, they keep saying Tommy. They call him Four Eyes. They call him a runt. Yeah, I don't think that they ever say what this little boy's name is, which I think is just really strange. I mean, we saw in issue 25 that happened once before in a Spawn comic where we had a main character. Oh, actually, here it is. So it's in it's in some of the exposition that his name is Pat. Pat Shaughnessy is his name. So, okay, he is named. Anyway, so Pat goes to leave, and unbeknownst to him, Tommy and his gang of bullies have been waiting all along, or maybe they're waiting outside his house because they know he's got to walk this way to come home. And they want their comics, they want their money, and so it doesn't take long before they attack Tommy. But Tommy, or Pat rather, the little boy who's bullied, Pat, perhaps being inspired by his recent interactions with Spawn and remembering some of the things Spawn told him about needing to stand up for himself and stand up for what's right, he for the first time ever does stand up for himself in attempts to fight back. He pulls on his mask. He says, "I don't think so, you jerks. I'm tired of it." And the boys look terrified. And so Pat's thinking, "Oh, this is great." They see the look in my eye. They see that I'm standing up to them, and there's actually fear on their faces. And Pat says, "Who's going to be first?" But actually what they fear is Spawn. Spawn was worried about Pat, followed him. He sees, and that's what these kids are freaking out about. And Spawn, not exactly 100% sure what Al Simmons was thinking, because again, he doesn't have full control over his body. And sure enough, even though he was there following Pat and maybe just wanted to scare these kids, the costume sees these kids as enemies, right? As people that need to be punished, as bad guys. And he just starts lashing out. And again, Spawn doesn't even have any control. And Pat's yelling, "You're hurting them, can't you see?" And Al Simmons is like, I can't stop. And then we find out that Al didn't even follow Pat. He said, "My costume followed you here on its own. I can't stop it. I don't have any control over it." So Pat's yelling, "Put him down, leave him alone." And you want to talk about standing up to somebody, brave enough to stand up to these bullies by Pat that, have been terrorizing him for God knows how long. But he's standing up to this costume he knows is really powerful, and gives Tommy and the other boys a chance to escape, to run away. So in a roundabout way, the costume, and I'm not saying it did it on purpose. It may really have just seen those boys as bad guys that needed to be punished. But maybe it's smart enough to have made it look that way, and it wasn't ever really going to hurt the boys permanently, but set up a situation where Pat could be the hero. Because that's exactly what happens here. Like all these boys now all of a sudden have respect for Pat because Pat saved them. And then the next day at school, the girl that he has a crush on, Pam Williams, comes up and introduces herself to him, even though, he obviously knows who she is. And anyway, this girl, Pam Williams, sits down and talks to him and says, "I heard what you did yesterday, helping Tommy and his friends. You're a real hero. Would you like to go to the Sadie Hawkins dance with me?" And it ends on a happy ending for Pat Shaughnessy. So pretty fun story. Doesn't really advance the narrative forward much. We know that Spawn survived the explosion at Curse's headquarters. We see that, or are reminded that both Grandma Blake and Wanda have had some really good fortune lately. Wanda appears to be sick, and that good fortune seems like it could be a pressure point for Chief Banks. And we're shown that Sam and Twitch have found conclusive evidence to tie Chief Banks to the murder of Senator Jennings' daughter. So and we didn't see Jason win, we didn't see Violator, and we got this sort of feel-good story about this kid, Pat Shaughnessy, who loves comics. So it's interesting. McFarlane doesn't really want to seem to give Al Simmons a chance to catch his breath. You almost feel bad for Al Simmons because he just can't catch a break. Now his body doesn't even work. His costume is kind of puppet stringing him around, making him do things he doesn't even necessarily want to do. Yes, it worked out in the end this time, but if Spawn has to go up against somebody like Curse or Saigor, he's going to be in big trouble, at least until he can heal his body. So when that might happen, how much energy it might take, we'll have to wait and see. As far as the art goes, it's pretty solid. I think Tony Daniel is kind of settling in to the aesthetic of Spawn really well, but I will say that it's not quite up to the level of detail that Capullo gives. There's something about Capullo's art on Spawn that it's just a little bit better than Tony Daniels. I don't know if it's the amount of detail in the backgrounds or if it's the dynamic panel layouts that are more reminiscent of McFarlane. It's not something I can quite put my finger on, but I will say this about Tony Daniels' art in this issue. He uses a thicker line weight this time, which is closer to the line weight that Capullo uses. So it does bring a consistency to the art that way if you're, picking up these issues in trade. So still a lot of interesting storylines going on. What's going to happen with the Violator and Jason Wynn and Chief Banks? When is the rug going to get pulled out from under Wanda and Grandma Blake? We didn't see Terry Fitzgerald at all in this issue. With Sam and Twitch focusing on Chief Banks, once he's taken off the table, will they switch their allegiance back to Spawn? We haven't had any of the heaven and hell supernatural stuff going on in a while. So yeah, there's still a lot moving. And although I am really enjoying it, I do wonder about kind of the story structure that McFarlane's given us here. I've talked about this with more modern books where we're given these plot threads and they go on and on and on and on, and nothing's ever resolved. Now, these older 90s comics, they have plot threads that tend to go longer. You're not necessarily writing for the trade at this point in time in comics. So I don't mind having the longer plots. I, in fact, rather enjoy them. But at some point, you have to resolve them. At some point, you got to resolve the Jason Wynn thing. At some point, you got to resolve the Wanda and Terry not knowing that it's Al Simmons. It can't just go on forever. We're 42 issues in. That's nearly 4 years. So it's time for some of these storylines to start wrapping up in my mind. So anyway, we'll have to wait and see how that unfolds over the next couple of issues. So anyway, that's going to do it for this episode, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, we appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.